The fluorescent lights of Lincoln Elementary's cafeteria cast harsh shadows across Maria Santos' weathered hands as she wiped down the last lunch table of the day. At 42, she had worked in this same cafeteria for 15 years, serving countless bowls of mac and cheese and chicken nuggets to hungry children who barely noticed her existence. But Maria noticed them, every scraped knee, every shy smile. Every child who came through the lunch line with holes in their shoes and hope in their eyes, she knew their names, their favorite foods, and which ones needed an extra helping because lunch might be their only decent meal of the day. What she didn't know, as she carefully stacked the plastic trays and prepared to clock out, was that in less than 24 hours, her entire world would collapse in the most humiliating way possible. The call came at 6:47 a.m. the next morning, jarring Maria from the restless sleep she'd managed between checking on her 78-year-old mother, Elena, who had been battling diabetes and heart problems for the past 3 years. Principal Johnson's voice was cold, professional, completely different from the warm greetings they'd exchanged just yesterday when he'd praised their dedication during the parent-teacher conference prep. "Maria, I need you to come in immediately. There's been a serious allegation made against you." His words hit her like ice water, but nothing could have prepared her for what awaited her in that sterile administrative office, where her husband Carlos sat smugly beside the principal, his city councilman pin gleaming on his expensive suit lapel. The audit revealed that $50,000 in lunch program funds has been systematically stolen over the past 6 months, Principal Johnson announced, sliding a manila folder across the desk toward Maria. Her hands trembled as she opened it, seeing bank statements, forged signatures, and transaction records that made no sense to her. Carlos wouldn't meet her eyes, but she could see the satisfied smirk playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched her world crumble. "The evidence clearly points to you, Maria. The transfers were made using your employee ID, and the money was deposited into an account under your maiden name." Maria's mind reeled as she stared at the documents, knowing with absolute certainty that she had never opened any such account, never stolen a single penny from the children she dedicated her life to serving. "This is impossible," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the humming of the air conditioning unit. "I would never. These children are everything to me. I've been here 15 years. I've never even taken so much as an extra apple home." But her protests fell on deaf ears as Principal Johnson's expression hardened with disappointment and disgust. Carlos finally looked at her then, and in his dark eyes she saw something that chilled her to the bone. Not surprise or shock at his wife's alleged crimes, but cold calculation and barely concealed triumph. "I'm afraid the evidence is overwhelming. Maria, security footage shows you accessing the financial computers after hours, and your keycard was used to enter the main office on all the dates in question. The security footage was grainy, manipulated, but unmistakably showed a figure in Maria's distinctive purple cardigan entering the administrative offices late at night. What the footage didn't show was Maria at home those nights, caring for her mother during her bad episodes, helping Elena with her medications and monitoring her blood sugar levels. Carlos knew her schedule better than anyone. He knew exactly when she'd be occupied and vulnerable. "I was home with Mama on those nights," Maria said desperately, looking between her husband and the principal. "Carlos, tell them. Tell them I was home with you and Mama." But Carlos just shook his head sadly, playing the role of the shocked and betrayed husband perfectly. "I'm sorry, Maria, but I work late most nights at City Hall. I wouldn't know where you were during those times," Carlos replied, his voice dripping with false sympathy that made Maria's stomach turn. She realized, in that moment, that this had been planned, orchestrated with surgical precision by the man she'd loved and trusted for 12 years, the man who had access to her employee information, who knew her routines, who had somehow managed to forge documents and manipulate evidence while maintaining his respectable image as a city councilman. Principal Johnson stood up, his face a mask of professional disappointment. "I'm afraid I have no choice but to terminate your employment immediately and refer this matter to the police." The walk of shame through the cafeteria felt like an eternity as Maria gathered her few personal belongings under the watchful eyes of her former co-workers. Margaret, who had worked alongside her for 8 years, averted her gaze and whispered to Linda about always having suspected something was off about quiet Maria. The children were in class, thankfully spared from witnessing their lunch lady being escorted out like a common criminal. But Maria knew word would spread quickly through the tight-knit school community. Her badge was confiscated, her keys taken, and she was informed that she was banned from school property pending the police investigation. As she walked past a serving line where she'd ladled countless portions of food with love and care, Maria felt a piece of her soul die. The police arrived at their modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street just as Maria was trying to explain to her confused mother why she was home so early. Elena, whose mind had been clouded by medication and illness, couldn't understand why uniformed officers were searching through their belongings, treating her daughter like a criminal. "Mia, what's happening? Why are they here?" Elena asked in Spanish, clutching Maria's hand with fingers made frail by arthritis and worry. Maria had no answers that would make sense, no words that could explain how their quiet, simple life had suddenly become a nightmare. Carlos arrived just as the officers were leaving, playing his part as the shocked husband discovering his wife's alleged crimes. "I can't believe this, Maria," Carlos said, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, his performance worthy of an Oscar. "How could you steal from children? From our community?" Mrs. Henderson from next door stood on her porch, arms crossed, shaking her head in disapproval. The Johnsons from across the street whispered behind their curtains, and Maria could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. In a matter of hours, she had gone from being a respected member of the community to a pariah, branded as the woman who stole food money from hungry children. The irony was devastating. She, who had often used her own meager salary to buy snacks for kids who came to school without lunch money, that evening, as Maria sat in their small living room trying to process the day's events, Carlos delivered the final blow. "I can't be associated with this, Maria," he said, loosening his tie and speaking in the same cold, professional tone she'd heard at the school. "My position on the city council. My reputation. I've worked too hard to let your mistakes destroy everything I've built." Elena had finally fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted by the day's trauma and confusion, leaving Maria alone to face her husband's betrayal. "I've already spoken with my lawyer. I'll be filing for divorce, and I want you and your mother out of this house by the end of the week." The house that Maria had helped pay for with her cafeteria wages, the home where she'd nursed her mother through countless health crises, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. Carlos owned it, had put it in his name alone when they'd bought it 5 years ago, claiming it was better for tax purposes given his city council position. Maria had trusted him then, just as she'd trusted him with everything else. Now she understood that her trust had been a weapon he'd used against her with devastating precision. "Where are we supposed to go?" Maria asked, her voice breaking. "Mama can barely walk. She needs her medications. Her doctors are all here." "That's not my problem anymore," Carlos replied, already heading upstairs to pack his clothes. "You should have thought about your mother before you decided to steal from children." His words were like knives, each one designed to inflict maximum damage while maintaining his facade of moral superiority. Maria wanted to scream, to fight, to demand the truth, but she knew it would be useless. Carlos had orchestrated this perfectly, positioning himself as the victim of his criminal wife's actions, while simultaneously destroying any chance she had of defending herself. The evidence against her was fabricated but convincing, and who would believe the word of an accused thief over that of a respected city councilman? The next few days passed in a blur of humiliation and desperate searching for somewhere to live. Every apartment Maria called, every rental office she visited, the story was the same. Her name had already spread through the local news as the cafeteria worker who embezzled education funds. Landlords hung up on her. Property managers told her they didn't rent to criminals, and even the cheapest motels in town refused her business. Elena's health was deteriorating rapidly under the stress, and Maria found herself carrying her mother to emergency room visits they couldn't afford, all while sleeping in their car in hospital parking lots. The woman who had once taken pride in her spotless home and her ability to provide for her family was now homeless, desperate, and completely alone. It was Margaret who inadvertently saved them, though not out of kindness. During one of Elena's hospital visits, Maria overheard Margaret gossiping with another former co-worker about the old riverside apartments on the edge of town. "They're condemned, you know," Margaret said with obvious satisfaction in her voice. "Scheduled for demolition in 6 months, but I heard some desperate people are squatting there anyway. Fitting place for thieves and criminals, if you ask me." The word stung, but they also provided Maria with her first real lead on shelter. The riverside apartments had once been low-income housing, but after a series of electrical problems and code violations, the city had condemned the entire complex. The building was exactly as bad as Maria had feared: broken windows, covered with plywood, graffiti covering the exterior walls, and an overwhelming smell of mold and decay that hit her as soon as she pushed open the damaged front door. But it had electricity in some units, running water that was questionable but functional, and most importantly, it was shelter for Elena, who was getting sicker by the day. Maria chose a second-floor apartment that seemed slightly less damaged than the others, with windows that still had glass and a door that could be secured with a chair wedged under the handle. She swept out the debris, scrubbed the surfaces with bleach and water, and tried to make it livable for her mother, who deserved so much better than this nightmare. Elena was confused by their new surroundings, asking repeatedly why they had left their real home and when Carlos was coming to take them back. Maria didn't have the heart to explain that Carlos had orchestrated their downfall, that the man Elena had welcomed as a son-in-law had destroyed their lives without a moment's hesitation. Instead, she told her mother they were temporarily staying here while their house was being repaired, a lie that felt both necessary and devastating. At night, Maria would lie awake, listening to the sounds of the condemned building, settling walls, scurrying rats, and the occasional footsteps of other desperate people who had found refuge in this forgotten place. The job search was brutal and humiliating in ways Maria had never imagined possible. Every application she filled out, every interview she managed to secure, ended the same way, with recognition, whispered conversations, and polite but firm rejections. "We'll call ya," became the standard response, and Maria knew they never would. The story of her alleged theft had spread through their small city like wildfire, and her face had been on the local news enough times that she was instantly recognizable. Even fast food restaurants and gas stations, places that typically hired anyone willing to work, turned her away once they realized who she was. The woman who had once taken pride in her work ethic and reliability was now unemployable in her own hometown, desperate for any source of income. Maria finally found work with a cleaning service that operated in the next town over, 30 miles away. The pay was minimum wage. The hours were brutal, and the work involved cleaning office buildings and medical facilities in the middle of the night when no one would see her face. She would leave Elena sleeping in their condemned apartment, take 2 buses to reach her work sites, scrub toilets and empty trash cans for 8 hours, then take 2 buses back home, arriving just as Elena was waking up, confused and afraid. The physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the emotional toll of hiding her identity, of working under a supervisor who treated her like she was disposable, of coming home to a building that smelled like failure and broken dreams. Elena's health continued to decline in their new living situation. The stress, the poor air quality, and the lack of proper medical care were taking their toll on her fragile system. Her diabetes was becoming harder to control. Her heart problems were worsening, and she was developing a persistent cough that worried Maria constantly. The emergency room visits became more frequent, each one resulting in bills they couldn't pay and medical advice they couldn't follow. "She needs a clean, stable environment," the doctors would say, not knowing that Maria was doing everything in her power to provide exactly that. The medications Elena needed were expensive, and even with the generic versions, Maria often had to choose between her mother's pills and food for both of them. 3 months into their ordeal, as Maria was mopping the floors of a medical office building in the neighboring town, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. 2 men in expensive suits were discussing a development project in hushed tones, not noticing the anonymous cleaning lady working nearby. "The riverside property is perfect for luxury condos," one of them said. "Close to downtown's river views, and once we demolish those condemned buildings, We'll have a clean slate." The other man chuckled. "Carlos Santos is handling the city permits. For the right price, he can make sure the environmental testing is expedited and any potential issues are overlooked." Maria's hands stopped moving as she processed what she was hearing. Carlos was involved in developing the very property where she and Elena were living. The condemned building that had become their shelter was part of a scheme that her own husband was orchestrating from his position on the city council. The men continued their conversation, discussing soil contamination reports that needed to be adjusted and environmental impact studies that could be manipulated to show favorable results. Maria felt her pulse quicken as pieces of a larger puzzle began falling into place. The rushed condemnation of the Riverside apartments, the quick demolition schedule, Carlos's sudden wealth that she'd attributed to his council work. It was all connected. That night, Maria sat in their tiny, decrepit apartment, watching Elena sleep fitfully in the makeshift bed she'd created from old blankets and pillows. For the first time in months, she felt something other than despair stirring in her chest. It was anger, pure and righteous, at the realization that Carlos had not only framed her and destroyed her life, but was now profiting from her misery. The building where she was forced to live, the condemned property that represented the lowest point of her fall, was part of his grand scheme to enrich himself at the expense of the community he was supposed to serve. Maria realized that her father's voice was echoing in her mind, memories of his work as an environmental engineer coming back to her with startling clarity. Eduardo Santos had died when Maria was 12, but he had spent years teaching her about soil contamination, groundwater pollution, and the environmental dangers of improper development. As a child, she had accompanied him to job sites where he tested soil samples and measured contamination levels. He had shown her how to read environmental reports, how to identify signs of chemical contamination, and how industrial pollutants could remain dangerous in soil for decades. At the time, Maria had been more interested in helping her father than learning his profession. But now those forgotten lessons were surfacing with remarkable clarity. She remembered him explaining how old chemical plants and industrial facilities left lasting marks on the land, how developers sometimes tried to build on contaminated sites without proper remediation. The next day, Maria began her own investigation with the determination of a woman who had nothing left to lose. During her cleaning shifts, she paid attention to every conversation, every document left on desks, every computer screen that remained open after hours. She learned that the Riverside property had indeed been the site of a chemical processing plant from the 1950s to the 1980s, manufacturing industrial solvents and cleaning compounds that had been dumped directly into the ground for decades. The plant had been closed due to environmental violations, but the contamination had never been properly cleaned up. Instead, the property had changed hands multiple times, with each owner passing along the expensive problem of soil remediation to the next, using her father's old equipment, which she had stored in their basement for years before Carlos evicted her. Maria began secretly testing soil samples from around the Riverside property. Working at night after her cleaning shifts, she collected samples from different areas of the complex, following the procedures her father had taught her years ago. The results were exactly what she had feared. The soil was contaminated with trichlorosilene and other industrial chemicals at levels far exceeding safe standards. The groundwater was polluted, the air quality was compromised, and the entire site represented a significant health hazard to anyone living or working there. Maria realized with growing horror that she and Elena had been slowly poisoning themselves for months. Armed with this devastating information, Maria faced a crucial decision. She could take her findings to the authorities and expose Carlos's scheme, but doing so would also reveal that she had been living illegally in the condemned building. She could try to quietly relocate Elena and herself to safety, but without money or resources, she had nowhere else to go. Or she could use this information as leverage against Carlos, potentially clearing her name and reclaiming her life. The choice became clearer when Elena had another health crisis, coughing up blood and struggling to breathe in that toxic environment. Maria realized that staying silent would not only kill her mother, but would allow Carlos to poison countless other families when his luxury condos were built on this contaminated land. The opportunity to act came when Maria discovered that David Restrepo, an investigative journalist from the city newspaper, was researching corruption in local government. She had seen his articles about questionable development deals and municipal contracts that seemed designed to benefit specific individuals rather than the community. Through careful research, Maria learned that David's own family had been affected by similar corruption years earlier, when his neighborhood had been displaced by a development project that promised community benefits but delivered only profits for connected insiders. His personal experience with municipal corruption made him exactly the ally Maria needed. But approaching him would mean revealing her identity and risking everything. Maria made contact with David through an anonymous tip, providing him with copies of the soil contamination reports and development documents she had gathered during her cleaning work. She suggested he investigate the Riverside Development Project and look into the connections between city officials and the development company. David's initial response was cautious but intrigued. The documents Maria had provided were legitimate and pointed to serious environmental and ethical violations. However, he needed more evidence and, eventually, someone willing to go on record with their knowledge of the corruption scheme. Maria knew that person would have to be her. Despite the risk to her safety and her mother's well, the turning point came when Elena collapsed in their apartment and had to be rushed to the hospital with what doctors diagnosed as chemical poisoning. Her exposure to the contaminated environment had accelerated her existing health problems and created new ones, including respiratory damage and liver complications that could be directly traced to the toxic soil surrounding their building. As Maria sat by her mother's hospital bed, watching Elena struggle to breathe with the help of an oxygen machine, she felt her last reservations disappear. Carlos had not only destroyed her life and reputation, he had poisoned her mother and was planning to poison countless other innocent families with his development scheme. With Elena stable but hospitalized, Maria made the decision to reveal herself to David Restrepo and provide him with everything she knew about the Riverside Development conspiracy. Their first meeting took place in a coffee shop 40 miles from their city, far enough away to avoid recognition but close enough for Maria to return to the hospital quickly. David was younger than she had expected, probably in his early 30s, with a kind of intensity that came from personal experience with injustice. When Maria told him her story, the frame-up, the embezzlement charges, the homelessness, and now the discovery of the environmental cover-up, David listened with growing anger and determination. "Your husband didn't just frame you for embezzlement," David said after reviewing all of Maria's evidence. "He stole that money himself to help finance this development deal, and he needed you out of the way because you might have recognized the environmental dangers. You're not just a victim of his personal betrayal. You're a witness to a massive fraud that could affect thousands of people." David's words hit Maria like a revelation. She'd been so focused on the personal betrayal and the immediate survival of herself and Elena that she hadn't fully grasped the scope of Carlos's crimes. The $50,000 stolen from the school lunch program was just the beginning. The Riverside Development represented millions of dollars in illegal profits built on environmental destruction and public deception. Working together, Maria and David began building a comprehensive case against Carlos and his co-conspirators. Maria provided inside information about the development timeline, the environmental testing fraud, and the financial irregularities she had observed during her time living on the contaminated property. David contributed his investigative skills, his media connections, and his ability to navigate the legal system in ways that Maria never could have managed alone. Their partnership was born from mutual necessity, but grew in a genuine respect and friendship, as they discovered they shared the same commitment to justice and protection of their community. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that extended far beyond Carlos and the Riverside Development. The same environmental testing company that had falsified the soil reports for Riverside had done similar work for other developments throughout the city. City council members had received kickbacks for expediting permits and overlooking safety violations. The mayor's office had been involved in suppressing environmental reports and silencing community concerns about air and water quality. Maria's case was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic pattern of municipal corruption that had been operating for years. As their investigation progressed, Maria continued working her cleaning jobs and visiting Elena in the hospital, where her mother's condition remained serious but stable. The doctors were optimistic that Elena could recover from the chemical poisoning, but she would need extensive treatment and a completely clean environment to heal properly. The medical bills were mounting beyond anything Maria could hope to pay, and the stress of fighting Carlos while caring for her mother was taking a physical toll. There were days when Maria questioned whether she had the strength to continue, whether it wouldn't be easier to simply disappear and start over somewhere far away from all the corruption and betrayal. David's first article about the Riverside development conspiracy was published on a Tuesday morning and sent shockwaves through their small city. The headline read, "City Councilman Implicated in Environmental Cover-Up Scheme," and the story laid out in devastating detail how Carlos Santos and his associates had planned to build luxury condos on contaminated land while hiding the environmental dangers from potential buyers. The article included copies of the falsified soil reports, documentation of the financial irregularities, and interviews with environmental experts who confirmed the severity of the contamination. By noon, Carlos had issued a statement through his lawyer denying all allegations and claiming he was the victim of a vindictive attack by his mentally unstable ex-wife. Carlos's response strategy was predictable, but effective in the short term. He positioned himself as the victim of a vindictive woman who was trying to destroy his reputation and career out of spite over their failed marriage. He reminded the community that Maria had been fired for embezzlement, painting her as an unreliable accuser whose claims should be dismissed as the desperate lies of a convicted criminal. Several city council members publicly supported Carlos, expressing confidence in his integrity and dismissing the environmental concerns as exaggerated claims from outside agitators. The initial public reaction was mixed, with some people expressing concern about the environmental issues, while others remained loyal to Carlos and suspicious of Maria's motives. But David's investigation had been thorough, and he had additional evidence that he released in subsequent articles over the following weeks. Bank records showed money flowing from the development company to Carlos's personal accounts. Email communications revealed coordination between Carlos and the environmental testing company to suppress unfavorable results. Most damaging of all, David had obtained recordings of conversations between Carlos and other conspirators discussing how to handle the environmental problem at Riverside without losing their investment in a development project. Each new revelation made Carlos's denials less credible and his position more precarious. The federal government took notice when David's articles caught the attention of the Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Federal agencies had been monitoring patterns of environmental fraud and municipal corruption across the region, and the Riverside case fit perfectly into a larger investigation they had been conducting. Within weeks of David's first article, federal agents were interviewing witnesses, subpoenaing documents, and building a criminal case that would eventually encompass not just Carlos, but an entire network of corrupt officials and complicit businesses. Maria found herself transformed from a discredited accuser into a key federal witness, with legal protections and support she had never imagined possible. The investigation moved quickly once federal authorities became involved. Carlos was arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, environmental crimes, and racketeering as part of an organized conspiracy to defraud the public and endanger community health. His assets were frozen, his city council position was suspended, and his luxury lifestyle came to an abrupt end as he found himself facing the possibility of decades in federal prison. Isabella, the mayor's daughter who had been having an affair with Carlos, distanced herself immediately once his money and power disappeared, claiming she had known nothing about his illegal activities and had been manipulated by his lies. Maria's vindication came in stages, each revelation bringing her closer to the complete restoration of her reputation and dignity. The federal investigation revealed that Carlos had indeed embezzled the school lunch funds to help finance his share of the Riverside development deal, using his access to Maria's employment information to frame her for the theft. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, electronic communications, and witness testimony all confirmed that Maria had been an innocent victim of her husband's criminal scheme. The school district issued a formal apology and offered to reinstate her, while a local police department quietly dropped all charges related to the embezzlement case. Elena's recovery became possible once Maria was able to move her to a clean, safe environment away from the contaminated Riverside property. With the support of victim services provided through the federal investigation, Maria was able to secure temporary housing in a clean apartment, while Elena underwent treatment for her chemical exposure injuries. The medical bills were covered by a victim compensation fund established by the federal government. And Elena's health began improving dramatically once she was no longer breathing contaminated air and drinking polluted water. For the first time in over a year, Maria began to hope that both she and her mother might have a future worth living. The legal proceedings moved forward with a kind of thoroughness and precision that only federal prosecutors can provide. Carlos's trial became a showcase for the broader corruption that had plagued their city, with Maria serving as a star witness whose testimony was both personally devastating to her former husband and legally crucial to the prosecution's case. She testified about Carlos's access to her employment information, his knowledge of her whereabouts on the nights the money was stolen, and his calculated manipulation of evidence to frame her for his crimes. Her testimony was calm, factual, and utterly convincing, painting a picture of systematic betrayal that left no doubt about Carlos's guilt. Carlos's defense strategy crumbled under the weight of the federal evidence. His lawyers tried to portray him as a small-time politician who had been manipulated by more sophisticated criminals. But the evidence showed clearly that Carlos had been one of the masterminds of the conspiracy, not a victim of it. His communications revealed him to be calculating, greedy, and completely willing to destroy innocent people to protect his illegal profits. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, Carlos showed no emotion. But Maria felt a sense of justice and closure that had seemed impossible during her darkest days in the condemned apartment building. The federal investigation ultimately led to convictions of 12 individuals involved in the corruption network, including environmental testing company construction company officials, and other city council members who had participated in similar schemes. The sentences were substantial. Carlos received 15 years in federal prison, along with orders to pay restitution to his victims and forfeit all assets obtained through his criminal activities. The environmental testing company was shut down, and its executives received prison sentences of their own. The broader message was clear. Environmental fraud and municipal corruption would be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. Maria's financial compensation came through multiple sources. As a whistleblower whose information had been crucial to exposing the federal crimes, she received a substantial settlement from the federal government under whistleblower protection statutes. Additionally, she was awarded damages in civil lawsuits against Carlos, the environmental testing company, and other co-conspirators who had profited from the fraud scheme. The total compensation was more than Maria had ever imagined possible, enough to pay for Elena's medical care, secure safe housing for both of them, and established a foundation for a new life built on justice rather than victimization. But Maria's transformation went far beyond financial compensation. Through her ordeal and eventual triumph, she had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. Her environmental knowledge, inherited from her father and sharpened by necessity, had become expertise that was valuable to community groups and legal organizations fighting similar battles against environmental fraud. Her experience as a victim of corruption had given her credibility and motivation to advocate for other victims who lacked the resources or knowledge to fight back against powerful interests. David Restrepo's reporting on the Riverside corruption scandal earned him national recognition and journalism awards. But more importantly, it established him as a trusted advocate for communities threatened by environmental fraud and municipal corruption. His partnership with Maria had evolved from professional necessity into genuine friendship and mutual respect, and they continued working together on investigations that helped other communities identify and combat similar threats. Their collaboration demonstrated the power of combining investigative journalism with grassroots knowledge and community activism. The Riverside property itself became a symbol of environmental justice and community empowerment. Under federal court order, the contaminated site underwent complete environmental remediation, with the costs paid by the corporations and individuals who had profited from covering up the contamination. The cleanup process took 2 years and cost tens of millions of dollars, but it restored the land to safe conditions for the first time in decades. Instead of luxury condos built on poisoned soil, the property became the site of affordable housing developments designed with extensive community input and environmental safeguards. Maria used her whistleblower settlement and lawsuit winnings to establish the Santos Foundation for Environmental Justice, named in honor of both her late father and her mother, who had become an unwitting victim of the environmental crimes Maria exposed. The foundation's mission was to help communities identify environmental hazards, advocate for proper cleanup and remediation, and support families affected by environmental contamination and related corruption. Elena, whose health had been restored through proper medical care and a clean environment, became an active volunteer with the foundation, sharing her story with other elderly people who had suffered from environmental exposure. The foundation's first major project was developing truly affordable, safe housing on properly remediated land in their own community. Maria purchased several properties that had been abandoned or neglected due to environmental concerns, had them professionally tested and cleaned up using the same rigorous standards her father would have demanded, and converted them into affordable housing for working families. Every unit met or exceeded environmental safety standards, and every tenant had access to resources and education about environmental health and safety. Carlos's downfall was complete and public. His 15-year federal prison sentence meant he would likely spend the prime years of his remaining life behind bars, with no possibility of early release due to the federal sentencing guidelines for his crimes. His assets were liquidated to pay restitution to his victims, leaving him financially ruined even if he eventually completed his sentence. Isabella, who had abandoned him as soon as his money and power disappeared, married someone else within a year and publicly stated that she had never truly loved Carlos, but had been attracted to his wealth and influence. The man who had once seemed untouchable in his position of power and privilege had lost everything through his own greed and cruelty. But perhaps most satisfying to Maria was the restoration of her reputation and standing in the community. The school district, where she had worked for 15 years, offered her a position as Director of Nutrition Services, with an apology from the school board and a commitment to implementing stronger financial controls to prevent future fraud. Parents who had once whispered about her in grocery store aisles approached her to express their gratitude for her courage in exposing the corruption that had threatened their children's school funding. The children she had served lunch to for so many years organized a welcome-back celebration when she returned to visit the cafeteria, presenting her with handmade cards, thanking her for protecting them and their school. Community leaders who had initially supported Carlos and dismissed Maria's allegations now sought her out for advice on environmental issues and corruption prevention. The mayor, who had initially backed Carlos's version of events, publicly apologized to Maria and asked her to serve on a citizen oversight committee designed to prevent future municipal corruption. Maria accepted the position, seeing it as an opportunity to ensure that other innocent people would not suffer the kind of systematic betrayal and persecution she had endured. Elena's health continued to improve in their new, clean environment, and she became something of a local celebrity as the elderly woman who had survived environmental poisoning and helped expose municipal corruption. Her doctor attributed her recovery not just to the improved environment in medical care, but to the sense of purpose and justice that came from seeing her daughter vindicated and their community protected. Elena often told visitors that her daughter's courage had not only saved her life, but had probably saved hundreds of other lives by preventing the contaminated development from proceeding. The environmental cleanup at Riverside became a model for other communities dealing with contaminated sites and developer fraud. Federal agencies used Maria's case as an example of how community members could identify environmental hazards and work with authorities to prevent environmental crimes. The cleanup process itself provided jobs to local residents and training opportunities for people interested in environmental remediation work. What had once been a symbol of contamination and corruption became a demonstration of how communities could reclaim and restore damaged land. Maria's work with the Santos Foundation expanded beyond their local community as word spread about her expertise in identifying environmental fraud and supporting corruption victims. She testified before congressional committees about the need for stronger environmental protections and whistleblower support systems. She consulted with community groups across the country who were facing similar threats from developers and corrupt officials who prioritize profits over public health. Her story became a case study in environmental justice programs at universities and law schools. The lunch program at Lincoln Elementary, which had been the original target of Carlos's embezzlement, was fully restored and expanded with additional federal funding secured partly through Maria's advocacy. The new program not only provided nutritious meals for students, but also included educational components about nutrition, environmental health, and community responsibility. Maria often visited to speak with students about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. The children who had unknowingly been victims of Carlos's theft became advocates for honesty and environmental protection in their own right. 5 years after her world had collapsed in that fluorescent-lit administrative office, Maria Santos stood before a packed auditorium at the State University, receiving an honorary degree in environmental science in recognition of her contributions to environmental justice and community protection. Elena, now healthy and vibrant, at 8, sat in the front row beaming with pride as her daughter was recognized not as a victim but as a victor, not as a criminal but as a champion of justice. The woman who had once been humiliated as a cafeteria worker accused of stealing from children had become a respected advocate whose work had protected countless families from environmental harm and municipal corruption. Carlos, meanwhile, was serving his sentence in a federal prison facility hundreds of miles away, with limited contact with the outside world and no prospect of the kind of comfortable future he had envisioned when he first began stealing from the school lunch program. His name had become synonymous with corruption and environmental crime in their community, a cautionary tale about the consequences of greed and the eventual triumph of justice over deception. The man who had thought he could destroy his wife and profit from poisoning his community had instead created the conditions for his own complete downfall and Maria's ultimate vindication. In her acceptance speech that day, Maria Santos looked out at the audience and spoke not about her personal triumph, but about the power of communities to protect themselves when ordinary people find the courage to stand up against corruption and environmental crime. She dedicated her honorary degree to her father, whose environmental knowledge had ultimately saved her community, and to her mother, whose suffering had motivated her to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for all families threatened by those who prioritize profit over public health and safety. The applause that followed was not just recognition of Maria's achievements, but celebration of the enduring truth that courage,